Alrighty, it looks like we are now live streaming on YouTube.
We should be, yes.
Awesome. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Kate Hefner, and it is a privilege and honor to be chairing this keynote with none other than Joy Sanchez-Taylor. Joy Sanchez-Taylor is a professor of English at LaGuardia Community College and a 2022 to 2023 Mellon ACLU Community College Fellow, whose research specialty is intersections between science fiction, fantasy, and critical race studies. Her book, Diverse Futures, Science Fiction and Authors of Color, examines the contributions of late 20th and 21st century US and Canadian science fiction authors of color to the genre. Dr. Sanchez-Taylor's research has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Science Fiction Studies, Extrapolation, and the Journal of Fantastic in the Arts. Today, we're very privileged to hear from Dr. Sanchez-Taylor, who will be delivering the keynote, Witches, Brujas, and SF Activism. And I will go ahead and hand it off to you. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Kate. And I just want to say how excited I am to be here. Hi, I know so many people in the Zoom room. Thank you guys for coming today. I'm so excited to be part of such a historic conference. And I do want to make sure that I thank Paul, Kate, and Dimitra for inviting me to speak. And I'll just go ahead and put up my slides and get started here. So once again, I just want to say that, this has been an amazing conference so far. And I've heard a lot of really great discussions over the last 2 days, not only on the history of achievements for women in science fiction and fantasy, but also some really innovative ideas for moving the genres forward. So thank you to everybody who's already presented. And I'm so excited for the presentations coming up today as well. But when I was asked to keynote, I had to think really hard about what I could add to such an amazing conversation. I had a feeling that Lisa and Cheryl would do an amazing, thorough job of putting the history of women in science fiction and fantasy in context, which they did. If you haven't seen their keynotes, they're amazing, and they're on YouTube, so go watch them. So instead, I decided to pull from some of my current fantasy research and to discuss, to do my keynote through one focused lens. And I think a witch or bruja is an important speculative figure that embodies past and current discussions of representations of women in speculative fiction. So I'm going to take privilege and go outside of the conference time period for just a minute to discuss the historical significance of witchcraft accusations to this talk. So I'm pretty confident that many of us in this Zoom room have heard stories of the Salem witch trials, specifically the ways that women were targeted and accused of communing with the devil and performing black magic as a form of social punishment. But I was surprised in my research to find a fantasy connection to the witch trials. So in the 16th century, several Scottish women were accused of witchcraft and specifically accused of communicating with the queen of the fairy realm and her consorts. So the picture on the slide here is the best depiction of witches and fairies together that I could find from this time period. And I want to give credit to Elma Wilby and her article, The Witch's Familiar and the Fairy in Early Modern England and Scotland, for providing me with the visual and really important information on the connections between fairies and witchcraft trials. So if you look at the image here closely, in addition to depicting spirits and the devil, which we might expect to see, The tiny figures forming a ring in the picture are actually labeled, if you look at number D, a fairy ring. And the castle in the background is described as an enchanted castle. So the fact that these witchcraft accusations often centered on connection to a ruler of the fairy realm, fairy queen, fairy king, who was often a queen, and the fact that some of these women were also forced to admit to accusations of having sex with these fairy figures. It shows the ways that the witchcraft trials were linked to a fear of the feminine, whether female supernatural beings, female sexuality, or females who possess knowledge connected to sex and reproduction, such as midwives. Women who embraced an understanding of nature and the body were often labeled witch. And I don't think that comes as much of a surprise, especially if you've attended any of the motherhood panels at this conference. And additionally, the labels of seer, conjurer, or, quote, wise and cunning woman, end quote, which is actually a direct quote from one of the witchcraft documents that I've encountered in my research. It also shows the link between accusations of magic use and female knowledge. So it's not at all surprising to me also that witchcraft accusations against Black and Indigenous women occurred during the Salem witchcraft trials. And while these accusations were documented, they have not been a major focus of the story of the Salem witch trials until pretty recently. So in the 17th century, a dark-skinned slave named Tituba, who was either of African or indigenous South American ancestry, was accused of witchcraft, likely for practicing forms of indigenous knowledge. These three pictures from left to right show on the left an 1880 engraving where Tituba appears as a dark-skinned older savage who frightens children, very much the fairy tale sort of hag figure. The middle picture is the most recent reprint of Maurice Condé's novel, I, Tituba, Black Witch of Salem, which was first published in the 1980s in French, where Tituba on this book cover is clearly Black. And on the right, an illustration from 1902 that depicts her with more indigenous elements. So the fact that Tituba's story, along with several other Black and indigenous women, is not very well known, shows the ways that women of color were both easily targeted for practices that were labeled Black magic by white colonizers, yet also easily rendered invisible in historical accounts. So my point with these early examples is to show the ways that fantastic language and beliefs in witchcraft accounts aided the witchcraft accusers and allowed them to mark women as other, and also that women of color are very easily marked as witch when they refuse to conform to Eurocentric colonial norms. And I see these examples as linked to a history of backlash against women who are seen as intruding on patriarchal control, very much like the women science fiction and fantasy authors we're discussing at this conference, who are often excluded or silenced and are just now being, starting to be recognized in recent anthologies. Of course, I have to mention The Future is Female and The Routledge Companion to Gender and Science Fiction, which are coming out pretty soon, that Lisa Yazek mentioned in her talk as well. And as for Tituba and her sisters of color, I think about the women of color who wrote science fiction and fantasy, who may never come to light because they were not able to use their own names, their own likenesses, or claim their work in their lifetimes. So it's important to remember the origins of the witch as a means of patriarchal and colonial control, especially when we analyze early work about witches. Yet for me, it's also interesting to see the ways that fantasy, horror, and even science fiction authors are working to challenge the idea of the witch figure as evil. In particularly, contemporary creators of color, which is the focus of my research, who often have to combat legacies of internalized colonization when writing about witches or La Bruja and her various depictions. So now I'm going to have a bit of fun for a minute and discuss a recent popular culture phenomenon connected to witch representations, the release of the second Hocus Pocus movie. And don't pretend that you didn't watch it. I know you watched it. I actually got the original idea for this keynote after Disney began advertising their sequel to their popular 90s film, because I was so struck by the differences in the two movie posters for the films. So the left picture is the 90s poster, the right picture is the new 2022 poster. And I think the questions that I ask myself when I look at these two posters fit in very well with the overall theme of my talk today. So in the new poster, the three main actresses look less stereotypically sexy, less comical, and more regal and confident. But does this new depiction mean that the actresses involved had more agency in the making of this film than the original? Does it indicate a shift in the way that contemporary US culture depicts witches? And what does the lack of diversity in this picture demonstrate? These are all questions that I'm considering as I think about the questions asked by the conference organizers. How far have we actually come in our mainstream popular culture depiction of witches? So again, no surprise to the people in this room, but fairy tales and folk tales are some of the most popular sources of negative depictions of witches. And particularly, I'm going to focus on the evil hag figure and the wicked stepmother figure. So many of us have encountered the trope of the ugly old woman who lives alone in the forest and tries to tempt innocent children or young women, typically to imprison them or eat them, which is, of course, also a working through of anxiety about female independence. Now, I know many fantasy scholars and folktale scholars doing extensive work on these types of fairy tale and folklore depictions and the gender roles that they uphold in patriarchal societies. So I'm not going to go there. That's not my research purview. But I do want to point to a few recent attempts by fantasy and horror authors to combat these stereotypical depictions. So the picture on the right is a new short story collection centered on Baba Yaga, a well-known Slavic folklore figure of an evil hag. And for this collection, 23 female authors were asked to reimagine the Baba Yaga figure in their stories. The collection's website describes Baba Yaga not as living alone, which is a common depiction in Baba Yaga and other hag stories, but as living with her sisters. And the website also states, and I'm quoting, quote, "She is wild, she is woman, she is witch, and these are her tales," end quote. So it's clear to me from the website description that this collection is focused on combating negative depictions of Baba Yaga and other hag figures as wild women or inherently evil witches. And instead, it's creating a more woman-centric view of the Baba Yaga figure, which is very exciting. The left picture is the first in a popular new set of fairy tale retellings that some of you might know by author Kaylin Barron that reimagine classic fairy tales with queer characters of color at the helm. Barron has reinvented so far Cinderella and Snow White. Importantly, both fairy tales that typically have an evil stepmother versus pure younger white woman component. But Barron reworks these classic stories to be more feminist, more celebratory of dark beauty, more queer, and more focused on female family relationships and inheritances than family conflict. So what I like about both of these efforts is that they not only challenge well-known tropes of the evil witch women, but that they also remind us that the witch figure is located across many cultures, and with a more matriarchal or feminist focus, has the potential to be a symbol of a powerful female inheritance. So what can we all gain when we embrace the figure or label of witch or bruja? And how can we move forward her legacy of transgressive disruption of patriarchal and colonial control? So since tales of witches are located across many cultures, I'm going to shift to focus on one that I know best, La Bruja. So La Bruja in the Americas is slightly different than the European witch figure, because in addition to the typical evil woman gender depiction, she's also very connected to the idea of a woman who is a traitor, both to her culture and to her people. La Malinche, an indigenous Nahua woman who served as a translator for Cortés and was consequently accused of aiding the Spanish in their conquest of the Aztec Empire, is an example that I've discussed at length when writing about first contact science fiction narratives in my book, Diverse Futures, because the role of cultural mediator in the Americas often fell to female translators. So the Bruja figure is very linked to punishment for the ultimate transgression, working with the colonizer, even when this work was forced on these women. So I put on this slide, as Irene Lara notes, quote, documented by many feminist scholars, women in Las Americas as heiresses of La Bruja, as well as Evil Eve and La Malinche and other female figures, continue to be physically and metaphorically kicked out of paradise for our desire to know, speak, and practice transgressive knowledge about nature, spirit, and the erotic, end quote. So Lara's article, Bruja Positionalities, by the way, is amazing. It's foundational, and if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. But her explanation of the Bruja is a nod to a cultural legacy of La Bruja as a warning to Latinas and Chicanas that moving away from a prescribed gender role often leads to a severance from family and culture. Lara moves on in Bruja Positionalities to discuss the ways that La Bruja has been positioned in 20th century narrative as a woman who is dangerously connected both to nature and the erotic. She does a great reading of Ricky Martin's Livin' La Vida Loca music video in this article. And I couldn't find a good still image for the female figure in this music video, but the song, which I'm sure many of us know, and the video, very 90s, both describe the woman as a sexy temptress with mocha skin and devil red lips. So this alternate version of the witch as sexy temptress, who causes men to lose control, is a common description that once again links female sexuality to evil and chaos, and also justifies violence against women. So the Bruja figure is very steeped in a history of patriarchal and colonial control, which is a large part of why when I teach about Brujas in my Latino literature class, my students are able to tell me all of the negative associations that they've heard from family members surrounding even the use of the word Bruja and the idea of practicing black magic, which is actually typically just indigenous practices like Santeria or Voodoo that have been marked as evil by colonizers, a view that's maintained by internalized colonization and practices of colorism that happen in Latino communities even today. And not to get off topic, but there actually was recently a very funny post that went around social media that was a morality advice list for college students. And it was making the rounds on my social media and getting a good laugh because the first piece of advice on this list was not to listen to professors who discuss science fiction. And I feel like if there was the same kind of list for conservative Latino students, the #1 rule on that list would be, don't listen to a professor who talks about brujeria. So that's my one long-winded academic joke for this talk. Hope you all enjoyed it. Thank you. And because of depictions of the witch as sexy temptress, La Bruja is frequently used as a label for Latinas and Chicanas who refuse to conform to stereotypical gender norms. But I argue that contemporary Chicanx and Latinx creators, especially those with claimed Indigenous and Afro-Latinx identities, are actively working to reinvent the term bruja along with its ideas of progressive power. So spoken word artists like Caridad de la Luz, who began performing with the stage name La Bruja in 1996. Her picture is in the lower left-hand side of the slide. Musicians like rapper Princess Nokia, as well as contemporary authors like Alex Temblador, Zoraida Cordova, Daniel Jose Older, Anna Maria McLemore, and Circe Moskowitz, among others, are taking cursed female figures, either La Bruja or figures linked to La Bruja, such as La Llorona, the weeping woman who is accused of killing her children, La Malinche, the cultural traitor, and rewriting their histories as cultural traitors to instead depict these women as powerful figures of change. So if you look at the pictures, the picture in the center is the latest cover for Zoraida Cordova's novel Labyrinth Lost. It's an amazing novel, by the way, and it teaches really well for those of us who use novels in our classes. But in this cover, the Bruja figure is depicted as a dark, powerful conjurer, combined with elements of Day of the Dead style makeup, which is an interesting choice because Cordova is not actually Mexican-American, she's Ecuadorian-American. However, the magic she references in her novel is highly influenced by the Day of the Dead ceremony, which is a ritual that helps maintain connection to ancestral heritage. So that use, the fact that the magic in the story is connected to this ritual connects themes of cultural identity, family acceptance, and legacy to the power of La Bruja. In the upper left-hand corner here, the Bruja figure from Princess Nokia's music videos, Brujas, is actually a representation of the Orisha Yemaya, a water goddess, which links the Bruja figure back to indigenous practices of connection with elements of nature. And huge gratitude here to Taryn Jade Taylor for introducing me to not only this video, but her article on Brujas in the new anthology Uneven Futures is required reading if you're interested in this topic and this music video. And even Caridad de la Luz, or La Bruja, recently hosted an Indigenous Futurism event in the Bronx, New York. I was so sad not to be able to go that day. But this event on Indigenous Futurisms was hosted by the United Confederation of Taino Peoples. And for those people who don't know, Tainos is an Indigenous Caribbean group that's famous for being the first people of the Americas that Christopher Columbus encountered, and who are often described in the past tense in historical accounts as if they were completely wiped out by colonization, which is a false representation of this group. So these are just a few examples of how the figure of La Bruja is being transformed into a symbol of great power that better fits Lara's definition of La Bruja as connected to nature, spirit, and the erotic. So I'm going to take a minute to do some close reading, which I love. And I have two quotes here. The first one is from Daniel Jose Older's short story, Phantom Overload, which is included in his Salsa Nocturna Stories collection. The picture was on the previous slide there. And the second quote is from Alex Temblador's Curanderas on the Ceiling, which is a short story that's part of the Speculative Fiction for Dreamers anthology. And again, both of these short stories are great and they teach really well. So in the first quote, Phantom Overload tells the story of a town that has been overrun by ghosts. And the Puerto Rican half-dead ghost wrangler who works for a corrupt white ghost council and who is tasked with taking charge of the situation. So in this first quote, the main character, Carlos, references Malinche because his work for the corrupt ghost council makes him feel like a cultural traitor. And the story states, quote, "Who's Malinche?" Jimmy asked. The chick that helped a couple of white guys on horses take down the whole Aztec empire, I say. Jimmy looks crestfallen, or got kidnapped and forced into being a historical scapegoat, more than likely. Gordo looks very sad all of a sudden. It's always easier to blame one of our own, end quote. So in the older quote, which, this short story collection was published about 10 years ago, actually, Malinche is described as a traitor, but then the description is quickly revised to acknowledge the likelihood that she was forced into her cultural mediation role. This quote doesn't exactly rewrite Malinche. And Older has written stories since that I think go much further in their representations of gender. In the decades since this short story collection was published, but it is a good acknowledgement of the forced role of female cultural mediators in a work of fantasy, so I wanted to include it. And the next quote is from Temblador's Curanderas in the Ceiling, and in this story, the curandera character, Doña Maria, is a healer who is described by the narrator's father as a witch. Readers never actually find out if the narrator is hallucinating while having a medical procedure done in the story, but either way, Doña Maria in this story is represented as a powerful and knowledgeable figure. So the story says, quote, "I curse you and all these doctors, hurting women with your medicines, your burning instruments. You will burn in hell with the devil, white man's whore, manditos." And then she spat on the ground twice to seal the curse. I hear Mama gasp as Doña Maria claps twice and disappears, leaving behind las estatuas on the bed, end quote. So in this quote, there's an actual reversal of the effects of colonization. The white Chicana doctor performing the medical procedure and her white nurse become the devils in the story, practicing harmful medicine, while Doña Maria is represented as having a deeper knowledge of culture and of medicine. And in addition, she can curse people and she has transformative powers. So again, this is a revised depiction of both the curandera and bruja figure. Very powerful representation, very exciting for me. And as I mentioned in the Temblador example, the line between bruja or witch and curandera or healer was often blurred as colonizers refused to learn about the cultures of the people that they colonized and simply labeled all beliefs that were not Christian-based as black magic. So contemporary science fiction and fantasy authors are also beginning to revisit ideas of healing and conjuring in their works as more science fiction and fantasy works are written that are not based on Eurocentric beliefs. So good examples of this trend include Nalo Hopkinson's Brown Girl in the Ring, River Solomon's An Unkindness of Ghosts, Andrea Hairston's Mindscape, and Kaysen Callender's Islands of Blood and Storm series. So I want to use some of my time in this talk to branch out just a little bit away from the witch bruja figure and discuss a few ideas that I think are important to support if we want to continue to look ahead to a future with more diverse gender representation. So first, I would like to see more stories with mature female and LGBTQIA protagonists. Maybe this is selfishly because I just passed the 40 mark myself, but we all want to see ourselves represented in the fiction that we read sometimes. And science fiction and fantasy hasn't always been kind to mature female characters. A lot of times mature women are the villains in the younger characters' coming of age tale. So these two pictures represent, two very exciting sort of attempts to push back at that idea. So the left picture is a great fan art piece of the character Essun from N.K. Jemison's Broken Earth trilogy. And I found that online, and I'm not sure if Very Wild Thing on Tumpik, good. And the picture on the right is cover art for a recent Kickstarter for an anthology titled Never Too Old to Save the World. And in this anthology, the authors involved specifically wrote stories with more mature protagonists. So these examples and their reception, important, the reception is very important here. 3 Hugo Awards for Jemison and full Kickstarter backing for the Never Too Old anthology. And I'll admit I backed that one myself. This reception demonstrates a growing interest in science fiction and fantasy stories with female and LGBTQIA protagonists who are not teenagers. And this trend may also help combat the tendency of critics and publishers to label some science fiction and fantasy stories with female protagonists that are not YA as YA. And to be clear, I love YA literature. I read it all the time. But even YA and middle grade authors, for example, Jiran Jejal, who just recently won a number of science fiction and fantasy awards for their novel Iron Widow, which is really fantastic, by the way, are also noting that there's an issue. So Jiran tweeted back in June of this year, and I'm quoting her, quote, "So tired of hearing about my writer friends getting rejected by publishers because we don't know if this is YA or adult. Just let us write the books we want," end quote. So while there is nothing inherently wrong with the YA label, it should not be applied to any book with a female protagonist, and it can lead to publishers not publishing works that can't be easily categorized. So another important element to moving gender and racial representation forward in science fiction and fantasy is more acceptance of genre hybridity. Women and LGBTQIA authors, especially authors of color, often either genre hop or create stories that combine or challenge traditional genre categories. These practices can lead to large publishers rejecting their works because, as Jiran noted, publishers don't like works they can't categorize or market easily. So authors like Sylvia Moreno Garcia and Tananarive Due have discussed the challenges for women authors of color who genre hop or blur genre distinctions. And I was actually just discussing this practice in a reading group led by the Gunn Center for Science Fiction in November on Rebecca Roanhorse's novel Black Sun. So for anyone who doesn't know, Black Sun is a fantasy story set in a Mesoamerican-like world that the reading group that I was a part of, agreed read more like historical fiction than fantasy. Anthony Boynton, who was the graduate student running the reading group that month, described Roanhorse's fantasy setting as, quote, "mundane, but not in a bad way," end quote. I would argue that some of this reaction comes from reader expectations that fantasy should be set in a Eurocentric medieval world. Without the flashy magic and enchanted castles, non-Eurocentric fantasy authors can run a risk of having their works overlooked or dismissed. And because of this influence, I would argue that readers and fans of fantasy, myself included, need to actively work to broaden their expectations of the fantasy genre, which is a huge part of decolonizing fantasy. But I also strangely kind of like the idea that genre hybridity has the potential to create fantasy that is so steeped in the fantastic experiences of Indigenous cultures that it actually reads as mundane. So I got a good laugh out of that one. And another category of genre hybridity that I'm really interested in is what I've taken to calling genre gender bending science fiction and fantasy stories. These are stories that combine elements of science fiction and fantasy, elements of both genres, with LGBTQIA characters and relationships. So I actually just wrote an opinion piece for Apex magazine that was published in the November issue, where I argued that these types of narratives are critical because they push the boundaries of both the science fiction and fantasy genres, while also challenging gender norms, especially in communities of color. So I would love to see more of this type of writing getting spotlighted. And 2 examples that I've encountered in this vein are Light from Uncommon Stars by Rika Aokai and Rain of Diamonds by Anna Marie McLemore. And the short story it's a short story. It's actually found in the Reclaim the Stars anthology, edited by Zoraida Cordova, which is on the left there, which, by the way, is an amazing anthology, super diverse, so many different kinds of science fiction and fantasy stories in there. And I think actually the next time I teach Latino literature, I could literally just use that text and do an entire class around it. And it hasn't received nearly as much attention as I would like it to. So for those of you who might not know, Light from Uncommon Stars features two main characters: a young trans violinist who becomes the student of a famous older female violinist who trains musicians in order to deliver their souls to hell. While it seems like a classic young hero versus old witch narrative, the plot actually twists, and the story doesn't end the way a classic fairy tale would. And at the same time, Aokai also manages to fold in narratives about Eurocentrism and immigration in this novel through a very Eurocentric demon character who's very funny, and some alien refugees who disguise themselves as Asian immigrants and run a donut shop. It's an amazing novel, guys. If you have not read this, this is the best novel I've read all year. So overall, this story uses elements of science fiction and fantasy very ingeniously to comment on race and gender in unique ways. And Reign of Diamonds is a story that I can only describe as two magical princesses in space who are attracted to each other, but are forced to duel to the death by their families. It's a great story. And the plot there might seem, it might sound simplistic when I describe it, but the narrative makes good use of flashbacks to show the ways that patriarchal Latinx cultures harm members who don't conform to stereotypical gender norms. So both of these stories are amazing. And by the way, if anybody knows any other examples of stories like these two that I've just described, I'm looking for them and I'm very interested. So please send them my way if you know any more. So on my next to last slide here, I want to go ahead and come back to the wisdom of Irene Lara, who notes that, quote, "If our work aims to be personally and socially transformative, what better symbol than a bruja whose work and words are about transformation?" So this conference is asking if the work done by female science fiction and fantasy authors in the last 50 years has actually been transformative. And I think I can safely say that the answer to this question that we've all been exploring over the last few days is it's complicated. Stereotypical depictions of evil witches or hags have not disappeared and are still being reinforced even in popular culture happening right now. So good examples, the most recent Cinderella remake with Camila Cabello. I thought this was a really interesting revision of the original in that it had a Latina lead, which was exciting. And it did attempt to explore the evil stepmother's motivations, but overall still reinforced the evil mature woman versus pure young woman trope. And even the recent Disney film Disenchanted has two evil fairy tale women battling each other. I was really hoping in this film to see Amy Adams' character become more of a cross between a stereotypical good and bad character. But the end of the film has her restored to her good princess self. I'm not giving anything away there. And so once again, this divisive binary for women is continuing in storytelling and particularly in our depictions of, different types of witches. So overall, the stereotype of the witch as evil woman does not seem to be going away. But the efforts of contemporary artists and authors to reclaim, rework, or remake witch or bruja figures gives me a lot of hope that pushback against patriarchal expectations for women is actually happening. Even though, as a mother of a daughter, I sometimes get discouraged at the backsliding that the US has done recently in its support for gender rights and identity. But overall, I think social transformation is possible. And one reason that it's possible is because younger generations are getting these transformative depictions of classic fairy tales and folk tales. They're seeing multiple iterations of witches, not just one stereotyped depiction. And I think that speculative genres are also undergoing a transformation. I hope that soon there's going to be less talk about which category to place a work in, and more talk about how genre hybridity allows authors to be transformative and to express their experiences in a way that feels almost, quote, mundane, but in a good way, end quote. And here's one element of the activism part of my presentation, because I promised in the title, some level of activism in this talk. Please support the works that I've highlighted on my slides in this presentation, because all of the authors represented here have been and continue to push the boundaries of speculative work. Unfortunately, too much of their work is being funded through Kickstarter platforms rather than organizations, universities, and major publishers. But I hope we can get to a place soon where all these authors are funded and are able to just focus on creating their works. And I want this selfishly because I want to see even more transformative depictions of witches. I don't think creators have come close to exhausting the possibilities of this transformative figure, and I'm curious about what direction she or they are going next. And because I have the privilege of being a full professor with tenure at my institution, I'm also going to branch out and give a few comments on how we can help transform academia by supporting women in academia, especially women of color and caretakers. Caretaking and its impact on people's ability to participate in academia and fandom has come up multiple times in this conference, and it's really no surprise. It's very difficult to understand how isolating being a parent or a caretaker can be in academia, especially during a pandemic. Academia and fandom success for caretakers can sometimes depend so much on what support systems those caretakers have available, which puts caretakers without family or community support at a disadvantage. This is one of many reasons why there is a low percentage of female professors with tenure or female full professors. And a couple of things that can help, again, the activism, make sure that you're citing women of color and LGBTQIA scholars in your scholarship. I'm sure many of us are, but we could do more. Get your libraries to buy their books and invite them to speak at your institutions. And this is especially critical for women who are independent scholars, who we know are doing very important work, but often without monetary or institutional support. And I will say that I see far too many women, especially in fantasy studies, doing a lot of work and who are very underpaid. Additionally, we all know that jobs, specifically in science fiction or fantasy studies, are difficult to come by. But when those jobs appear, the institutions hosting them need to think hard about how to attract a diverse pool of candidates, both in terms of gender and of race. And I want to acknowledge Florida Atlantic University for doing just this recently in their job search for a professor of science fiction. Also, professors who are further along in their careers could consider reaching out to faculty caretakers in their departments or independent scholars and offering to collaborate on service work or on publications. And again, I'm sure some of you are, but we could again be doing more. I've been very fortunate in my career so far to have other scholars pass along invitations for opportunities to me when they couldn't sign on themselves. And not having to chase down those opportunities, not having to take the mental labor time to find those opportunities has made my life so much easier, as did being offered paid speaking and reviewed opportunities. Remember, caretakers might have to pay a sitter to attend events if you can even find one right now during the pandemic. And where I am, sitters cost $25 an hour. So I will say that the most important thing that I did personally for my career is to choose academics in my field who were doing research similar to mine and just cold emailing them asking for help or advice. I was very lucky that these academics made time for me when they were under no obligation to do so. And I know that not all scholars can say yes to every request, but if you're a younger scholar, it still doesn't hurt to ask for help or advice when you need it. And since I had very few colleagues at my school, it's no secret I work at a community college. The research that my department does is all over the place because of that. I don't have many colleagues at my school that study speculative fiction. So I needed to go outside of my department for mentorship. And I was also able to pay attention to where my mentors were publishing, which is what led to Diverse Futures being published as part of the new Sun series at Ohio State, which, by the way, I highly recommend for authors doing research on science fiction and fantasy, race, and gender. So my overall point here is that I would not be where I am today without other scholars and their generosity. So I hope that my suggestions for actions can help scholars see that this work is not supposed to be done in isolation. And I hope we can all continue to build communities of scholars with similar interests even after this conference ends. So I want to end by reiterating my thanks to the conference organizers for inviting me to speak, and to thank all of you for making time to come and listen. I know this is a busy time of the year for all of us. Many of us have lots of family obligations and community obligations right now. And it just means so much to me that you all came into the Zoom room and made time to come hear me speak today. And I look forward to hearing even more amazing papers from all of you today. And by the way, I'm always happy to connect with other scholars who have similar research interests. I'll put my email and social media details in the chat after I finish speaking here. And please feel free to reach out. Again, thank you all, and I look forward to further discussing the themes of this talk in the Q&A section. Thank you, guys.
Fantastic. All right. Let's give a big round of applause for Dr. Sanchez-Taylor's keynote, which was truly such a wonderful conversation, and your insights, your just so warmly and well received. Thank you so much for being in this space and yeah, with the keynote. Great. So I do want to alert folks that there is the question and answer function within this Zoom room. So please feel free to drop in your comments or your questions, and I will go ahead and forward that to Joy.
Yes, I'm going to print out this chat because I'm seeing so many amazing comments.
Yeah.
I think somebody even asked if there's a list. I can make my slides available if you guys want to send them out.
Yeah, we do want to honor your time and your labor. It is such a privilege to be here with you and to have you do the keynote. So, you know,
it's fine.
We don't want to overburden you. You know, it seems like there's always like the scholars of color that are basically have to, you know, do the labor, do the work. And so we don't want to overburden you.
Thank you.
Fantastic. All right, great. So the first question that I have is from an anonymous attendee. And it seems like women of color in SFF are leaving academia or never getting even the chance to stay. How do we work to change these structures within huge systems?
This is a really hard and depressing question for me. We have to be realistic. Jobs in the humanities are shrinking. Unfortunately, I'm not going to say I have an answer for that because I can't control the systems that create jobs. But I will say that I took an opportunity. I was very lucky. I was very lucky to get a job right out of my PhD. And I think one of the reasons that I was able to do that is because I just literally applied to everything. And I know that not everybody can do that. Some people are place-bound, and that can make things really difficult. But I was also open to community college teaching, and I got really lucky in being able to be hired at a community college that also somewhat supports research. I'm saying somewhat now because they've just taken away our travel funding. But, you know, I have, through the CUNY system, more institutional support for my research than I would at some other community colleges. So I'm not going to say that I have an answer for that, but I will say that, you know, some of the things that I suggested for support for women scholars and caretakers are especially important for scholars of color. You know, if you have a PhD student who is a mother, who is a caretaker. I was literally sick for 6 weeks this semester because my daughter just started school and she brought home every single plague imaginable. It's especially awful right now during the pandemic with all this illness. So flexibility and understanding, you know, really go a long way. Mental health support. I see way too many grad students and PhD students on my social media feeds talking about how isolated they feel, how, you know, how discouraged they feel. So we need those supports, and we need to not judge people who leave academia. It is perfectly possible to get a job alt-hoc and still participate in research. We see people who do it. We want to celebrate those people, and we want to make it clear to our PhD students that that is a viable opportunity for them. So not, you know, this whole you're either in an institution or you're excluded. So, you know, we don't want to end up doing that. We want to make it clear to students that they can still participate, even if they don't end up with the, you know, tenure track job.
Thank you so much for that. There's so many follow-up questions about that I have about that, but I'm going to ask you privately because you're in the so one question I do have for you, Joy, is do you see any connections between the transgressive natures between Brujas, the tale of La Llorona, and also the revaluing and reestablishing of Chingona culture? There's a way that, yeah. Do you see any connections in that?
I think Sharon could answer this one even better than I could, but I'll give it a shot. Yes, I think that, you know, I think Lisa and Cheryl did such a great job, you know, with timelines of sort of, you know, progressiveness in women in science fiction and fantasy. And if I had taken the time to make my own chart, which I probably should have, I would say that about, you know, 10 years ago, we saw some efforts to sort of revamp the Bruja figure, you know, La Bruja, the spoken word performer. Again, Daniel Jose Older and his short story that I referenced, but it wasn't getting very much attention. A lot of this was very localized to New York City, and it wasn't getting nearly as much attention. But in the last 5 years, I've seen a real explosion of female creators who are taking these labels and reworking them and just, you know, really decolonizing them. And showing, you know, female power through this embracing of labels that are often very taboo in Latinx cultures. You know, some of my students don't even want to say the word bruja. You know, it's like, you know, there's this idea of invoking and bringing bad luck, bad juju to you. You know, a lot of them are also very Catholic. So you know, I have to be careful when I'm talking about these things to be respectful, but at the same time, there are a lot of women who are saying, fuck it. Sorry for the curse word, but, you know, I'm going to take this, I'm going to embrace this figure, and I'm going to show you, the power, sort of the embracing of the dark side, if I want to get punny, but literally in so many ways, the dark fantastic, and also the dark skin, and also, the darkness, that we're so afraid of with black magic, with Santeria, So that's what I see going on. But again, Taryn, please, in the chat, if you have other comments, help me out here.
Fantastic. So we have a question from Taryn. Can you expand more on how conversations around Indigenous science is FF with your idea of gender and genre bending?
So far, I've only found the 2 examples, and I really need more examples of this, because I think they're out there. And one of the hard things about the research that I do is finding the texts sometimes, again, because traditional publishers sometimes don't want to embrace these ideas. But Aokai in particular, the ways that she took, science fiction ideas of, advanced technology and alienness, and combined them with fantasy elements of, hell and the devil and Eurocentrism. This in particular, because there's a lot of classical musical references. And so the Eurocentrism becomes like, classical music becomes a stand-in for the Eurocentrism and the devil character who's trying to get the main character to give him a soul. And, what I was seeing in that is just this expert blending of both genres, which I love anyway. I'm always excited when I see authors doing that. But the ways that she did that in order to be able to talk about race and gender are really exciting to me. In terms of Indigenous sciences, I'm not sure I'm seeing that yet. Certainly something like, River Solomon's An Unkindness of Ghosts brings a healer character together with a generation starship. Maybe, I'll have to think about whether that's in a similar vein. But I also spent a lot of time explaining why that text was science fiction and not fantasy. So I may have to go back and revise my opinion, but I still don't see, there's a healer element, but not a fantasy element as far as the way that I categorize things. But in terms of genre hybridity, we should definitely be thinking about, that text as a hybrid, for sure. So I haven't answered that question at all. Sorry, Taryn.
The next question that we have, thank you so much for that response, Joy. The next question that I have is from Cheryl Morgan. And she asks, would you count the recent She-Ra reboot as an example of genre and gender bending?
I will admit to I haven't seen it yet. I do a lot more with text than I do with TV right now. I don't have as much time for TV and film, unfortunately. I don't know enough about the tech in She-Ra. I know about the fantasy elements, and I've heard really good things about gender representation in that series. But I don't know enough about the science fictional elements, I don't think, to be able to speak to it. But I think somebody else answered for me, so good.
All right.
Thank you, guys. I'll look into it, though.
We have a question from Emily Cox Palmer White. They write, thank you so much for your interesting keynote. I'm an independent scholar and a mother of a young baby, so thank you for highlighting the difficulties with doing academia this way. Any advice for how to make academia work from outside university affiliation would be much appreciated. So the alt-ac question.
Yeah. This is where we need to be giving more support. Because when you're not affiliated, there's no shame in not being affiliated with an institution. You can do research not affiliated with an institution. The issue is the support, specifically access to library resources and funding for research, right? So those are the things you don't get if you're an independent scholar. So that's where I would really love to. There was a great opinion piece in the Chronicle recently about this, about how scholars who are affiliated with institutions can reach out to independent scholars and offer resources. I think if you know an independent scholar, you should offer, if they need something from a library, and they can come to you and ask you to get that for them, that would be very helpful. There are grants. The grant that I got from the Mellon ACLU Foundation technically is for community college faculty. You have to be teaching at a community college. But I'm sure there are other grants that people can get even if they're not affiliated with an institution. But if you are, and you do get a grant that allows you to hire, hire an editor, hire a manager, something like that, offering that position to somebody who's an independent scholar could be really helpful. So I think there are ways that we can take the resources that we get, those of us who have the privilege to be working at an institution, and we can, reach out to our adjunct scholars, our independent scholars who aren't always given those resources. And if you can, if you can manage it with your schedule and you can adjunct a class anywhere, at least that would get you the library access. So, those are workarounds that I can think of off the top of my head. Unfortunately, some of those also involve more work for the, scholars involved, unfortunately. But yeah, I think we just need a chain of support at this point because it's so bad. The job market is so bad right now. And I don't want to make it sound like, oh yeah, it's all roses, you're going to get a job, no problem. Like, I can't guarantee that for people coming out of PhDs, but I think we can find a way to support people coming out of PhDs who, who don't find jobs or are still looking. There are ways that we can support those scholars, and we need to be doing that more.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Oh, what a fantastic keynote. That was both inspiring, informative, and just, it was such a pleasure to be with you in this space and to be a part of listening to your keynote. So again, a round of applause for Dr. Joy Sanchez-Taylor. There's lots of emojis fluttering up the screen. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you again for a wonderful keynote. And can you tell us where to find you on social media?
Yes, I did promise to do that. And then I did not. I totally did not do that. Where's last? I'll put it in the chat, but it's basically at J Sanchez-Taylor on Twitter. Yeah, I think the T is capitalized. Unfortunately, I'm still, oh, thank you. You type faster than I do. I'm still on Twitter for the moment. I know a lot of people are escaping Twitter. I just spent so much time building up my profile on Twitter. But if I change it, I will let you guys know. I will put my email in the chat as well. And I am always available. I'm fortunate this semester to be on research. I've gotten some research leave, so I'm a little bit more available than usual. So that's my email in the chat. And Paul, that's really exciting about how the excess funds are being used. I'm really glad to see that. So yes, and this, to the conference organizers, I love how this is being done. This is a sustainable model. It's virtual, so people have more access. You're using the excess funds to good use. I'm really, really responsible. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much again for your labor, for your care, and for your brilliance, Joy. And I will see folks at the next panels. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you, guys.